Welcome, everybody, to another special edition of the EdUp Experience podcast. This is part 4 of a 6-part mini series that we're calling The Currency of Change, talking about the challenges in dealing with the headwinds in higher education and all that implies. And as I say, episode 4, you might have deduced that means there are 3 before this, and there are, but you certainly do not have to have listened to them before participating today. So we're glad you're here. Today's discussion, part 4, is called Pulling on the Same End of the Rope. And our specific focus is on the collaboration between marketing and enrollment and admissions, and how that collaboration should work or sometimes work. So again, your host for today, my name's Andy Bennis, and I'm the Associate VP of Marketing Communication at Los Angeles Pacific University. And again, for this episode, my co-pilot is...
I am Dr. Jamie Brownlee-Turgeon, and I am the Vice Provost of Operations of Graduate and Professional Studies at Point Loma Nazarene University.
And given that you said that, knowing that you're not feeling 100%, I'm even more impressed, Jamie.
Hey, I'm doing what I can.
Which is also why Jamie's joining us by phone and not, and she graciously decided not to face me here in the usual office space here. So appreciate that, Jamie. But I hope you get well soon. And we can't tell from your voice now, but if you run out of steam, we'll understand why. So marketing, enrollment, this whole collaboration thing. I think a good place to start is the fact that you and I have been in and around this world for a very long time, for a big chunk of our higher ed careers, either directly in, the enrollment world, the marketing world, or overseeing both at any given time, in our various roles at various institutions, including while you and I overlapped at LA Pacific. But it's an interesting world because I often feel, and maybe this is a good place to start, defining some of those roles. I sometimes feel like people outside of marketing enrollment sometimes see them as two sides of the same coin and just think of them together, even though in actual practice and actual structure and function at most institutions, they're very, very different and very, very separate, not just physically where they're located, but reporting structures, management structures, leadership teams. They come in all shapes and sizes, but they're often very different and separated. Has that been your experience?
Absolutely. And I think when they do partner well together, institutions believe, oh, yes, of course, because they're on that same side of that coin. And it's just not the case. Our functions and what we do, while there is some overlap, they're very different. Yeah. And that needs to be taken into consideration. But I like that you highlighted that they're in different parts of the institution. Yeah. You don't usually report to the same person unless they're at cabinet and reporting to the president, which is a whole different ballgame. Right. So I think that's important to note as well, that they find themselves at different places in the institution.
Yep. And I was amazed, actually, and I continue to learn how varied it is. You and I run into each other at conferences and with current colleagues, former colleagues, and all the conversations you have. But I was even via email recently part of a listserv where folks in similar roles put out questions and just kind of get some feedback from colleagues at other institutions. And somebody had put out a question about how their departments are structured because they're doing some reorganizing and they're trying to figure out how to structure the department. How big is your team? Who do you report to? And I was floored at the variety of responses. Some have super small teams of like 3 or 4 people in-house and then a ton of outside vendors. Others had full-blown agencies, in-house 20 some odd people that include video, full-time video production people, social media people, graphic designers, copywriters. Like a full marketing agency in-house serving the whole university. So there's team size is one variable, totally across the continuum in terms of size. And then function. Some do just one little bit of it, and then like each department sort of has their own marketing function embedded in it. So I was amazed to find out how varied that is and what marketing, quote unquote, marketing means to different departments and different institutions.
Well, I'll say one thing I think that isn't varied. Everything you highlight is in fact true. At the same time, when I go to conferences or I meet with enrollment people, there is a constant complaint. How in the world do any of you work with your marketing departments? And that is a constant. If you go to just an enrollment conference, you get that feedback constantly. And I know from working with some of my marketing colleagues that when they go to marketing conferences, they're complaining about enrollment. And so I think that while they land in different places in the institution, they come in different shapes and sizes, the one constant is they're typically at odds with one another.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's always good to have multiple perspectives from both sides of the fence. And speaking of multiple perspectives, this is probably a great time to introduce our special guest for this episode. So once again, you don't have to take just our word for it, but we'd love to get the input from somebody else in another angle in another institution. So joining us today is Sharon Ayala. She's the VP of Marketing at Abilene Christian University in Texas. And Jamie, I know you guys were former colleagues, so why don't you complete the intro there for Sharon?
Yeah, so I just saw Sharon on your LinkedIn today. First of all, hello, Sharon. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, definitely. So I saw on your LinkedIn this morning that you have been at Abilene Christian University for 1 year. Congratulations.
Thank you. It went by very, very quickly and also so slowly, but thank you.
Right.
Isn't that often the case?
Parallel universes.
Well, just for our listeners so that they know, Sharon and I worked at Point Loma Nazarene University for the last 5 years. I know she was there for longer, all in that marketing department. But we worked closely together, and then I worked with Andy at Los Angeles Pacific University. So this is a fun dynamic for me to engage with both of them today.
Worlds colliding. It's okay. It's all a family affair. We're all in the higher ed family for everybody listening, and then of course we've all got our fun little connections. Although it's funny, the longer you're in this industry, the more you realize how small the universe actually is. Right? When I run into former colleagues, even from my DeVry University days or wherever it is, I'm realizing, wait a minute, you're still here in the industry. Good for you. So we're like survivors that just keep running into each other. But it is interesting. And Sharon, we're obviously welcoming you into the conversation and getting your perspective. Why don't we start? I think a great place just to hear from your perspective. Jamie and I in previous episodes have had a chance to kind of share a little bit of the dynamics at our institutions, but tell us about how things are structured at Abilene Christian in terms of marketing and enrollment, and then a little bit about the scope of what marketing actually entails for your group.
Yeah, so very different. And I think early listening in on how you were opening things up, I would totally agree that your experience of the listserv, every institution is different, and that's across many different departments. But I think marketing is really unique in that. And I've seen it across a lot of different models, a lot of different reporting structures, but a lot of different scopes of work too, which is where I think a lot of the difference is. And ironically, some of that tension that you were talking about. So at ACU, it's a very unique situation. And I've been there for a year, like you mentioned, and I'm still kind of figuring out the landscape. So marketing at ACU traditionally is pretty typical to sort of the roots of where I think marketing and communication grew out of higher ed over the last few decades. And so it's a little bit behind. It's funny because when I first started at Point Loma, it was very similar. I used to say, like, we're kind of like the Kinkos of campus. You come to us, you ask for a print thing, you ask for a deliverable, we put you in the queue, and we get to you when we get to you. Not actually really a whole ton of marketing. And I would say that is partially why, or a big reason why I was brought to ACU, is to build out an actual marketing function. So I think as I'm hearing the conversation that you both are having, I think about how marketing comes to the table a lot of times from that kind of historical or traditional view of marketing and communications that's very much like a production shop as opposed to a revenue driver, a demand gen driver, and that real partner with enrollment.
Right. And in some cases, both or all of the above, or, I'm resonating as you're speaking. I mean, our internal team is on the smallish side, but when I think about all the things that are included, and sometimes I run the list off and go, oh yeah, we do some of that, but not all of that. They're obviously, for us, the demand generation is a big piece of it. So there's the paid social media, paid search engine marketing, and all the other things that go into demand gen or lead gen, however you phrase it at your institution. But then there's, like you just said, the meeting the individual needs. Somebody needs a custom banner for an email. Someone needs a print piece. Someone needs a brochure. Someone just needs an individual graphic. And all of a sudden, much like an IT department has help desk tickets, we have these product requests or project requests, and we fulfill them. Other places don't touch it. Social media. Well, social media is just outside of marketing, because it's just a culture thing where it's a student life thing, not a marketing thing. And other places where it's all under one roof. Jamie, is there anything unique about how it's structured at Point Loma?
No, I think it's how she described it. Was that print shop, that Kinko's, and now it's transformed and is really a revenue driver with me. And I think that's what I appreciate about what Sharon and I were able to do when we collaborated together. Was we shared in enrollment goals. It wasn't just mine, and most think, hey, that's just Jamie's goals. It's just enrollment's goals. But we came together and we built an inquiry model that had shared accountability. And she had already done a lot of work in the marketing department to take them to beyond a Kinko's, but that just took it to, I think, a whole new level, launching a campaign for us. And so I would actually love to hear from you, Sharon, in terms of you changed that Kinko's model to a full-blown marketing department at Point Loma. You're hired at Abilene Christian to do the same thing. What advice would you give to someone in marketing coming in saying, how do you make that shift? And then how and when do you start building that relationship with enrollment that's so integral to the operation?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I think about a lot is, what are your success measures? When I first came into ACU and did like a current future state assessment, one of my core findings was our current success measure is client satisfaction. And we talk about our campus partners, and I'm trying to change that language actually right now. You're not clients, you're campus partners. If we measure, you are what you measure. If our success measure is client satisfaction, sort of are people getting what they want, when they want it, in the format that they want it, then you're going to keep doing that kind of work, and people are going to keep expecting that that's the kind of work that you do, and and how they measure your success. So that's kind of step one, is what is your success measure? If your success measure as a marketing department is to drive demand, to drive revenue, to drive enrollments, then you kind of have to back all the way up and say, okay, how does that look different than what we're doing right now? Really practically, one of the first things that I've engaged with, or I did at ACU, was project management, to say, how do we offload a lot of the work that's really typical that marketing takes on, like all of that print stuff? I actually put percentages down to it and said, I want to get down. We were at 100% only drive what people ask us to do. I want to get that down to 25%. So that means we need to create templates, we need to create outsourced partnerships, and we need to start saying no to stuff and building a comp plan with campus to get that different way of doing business kind of solidified at the organization, which is not easy. But that's kind of step one. Then to engage with enrollment, I would say, first of all, enrollment, I always say, if we don't meet enrollment goals, it's enrollment's head on the chopping block. It's not mine. So I have to show up to the relationship in that way and say, I understand that, but I want to be a partner to help drive that success. So I didn't really do much decision making in my first, few months at ACU. I did a listening tour, just tried to understand, what in the years that we've been successful, what's gone right? In the years that we've failed, what's gone wrong? And another part of that is to really be versed in the data. I think a lot of times marketing is kind of seen as the creative arm of campus, but they're not really they're not Excel whizzes, they're not in the data. We really have to be better about being able to look at the data, start seeing patterns, pull insights out of it, so that we can show up to the table and say, here's sort of what we would suggest in terms of what we need to be doing to, participate in that shared accountability like you were talking about.
Yeah. I think that resonates. Everything you just said resonates with a lot of folks, because two things you hit that we're going to obviously dive into a little more deeply, and that's expectations, and then what that translates into as far as goals. And the majority of our conversation, obviously, is the relationship between marketing and enrollment. But on the same note, even within marketing, sometimes how the marketing department sees themselves is at least as big an obstacle, because you're dealing often with a lot of creative folks. And for creatives, the art form is the work. And rather than tying it to other outcomes, well, hey, I did my part. We updated the website. We gave it a new look and feel. Hey, we're creating print collateral or web collateral, digital graphics or whatever. We're done with our part. What happens after that is somebody else's concern. So there's that accountability piece that you just touched on. What is the department actually accountable for? Even if you're involved in generating demand gen from prospective students, there can be this which is obviously way more directly tied to enrollment. There's still this element of, well, we just get it going and then make sure all the inquiries make their way to you. And then what you guys do with them is totally up to you. And there's no back channel or no two-way communication about, well, is it working? Are some campaigns more productive than others? Are certain programs, getting more love than others? And we haven't even brought the academy requests into it, when you've got deans requesting more love for their programs than any other, and then marketing stuck in the middle with how to handle that. But it is interesting that how the KPIs or the goals or the accountabilities of individual staff folks or the entire department, how those are structured has a lot to do with the attitudes that you're dealing with when you look at each other across the fence.
I'd like to add there that when you talk about who is marketing, what are their goals, from the enrollment standpoint, it's often, why doesn't marketing just do what I need them to do? Like, why don't they just create the brochure I need, update the website how I want? And it's that client mindset. Mm-hmm. And so that loop you're talking about, Andy, it's how do you sit at the table and look at the data together and interpret how can marketing support what enrollment's doing? How can enrollment support what marketing is doing? And until you start having a dialogue and reviewing the data together, it does seem like a client relationship. Now, right. Who's the client? I don't know. Okay, it depends what side of the table you're sitting on. But again, it's changing that perspective of, it isn't I now pass it off to you and I'm done. It isn't I just need you to do what I'm asking you, and we don't need to talk beyond that. It truly is sitting down at the table, reviewing the data together, figuring out what can marketing contribute, what can enrollment contribute, and like the perfect sweet spot to move forward. That's what's needed.
And I think, I'm going to ask about your feedback on one piece of that. Is that possible to do, or at least optimally, without any kind of shared goals? Because if we sit down at the table to collaborate and I'm just doing it out of the goodness of my heart to be a good team player, that's one thing. But if we somehow share some of the same goals, and dare I say marketing having some accountability for enrollment results, without even a little hint of that, kind of tough, right? Now you're just relying on good stewardship, good colleague, good team effort. To what extent might some form of a shared goal, or at least even if they're totally separate goals that point in the same direction? I mean, to the theme for today, pulling on the same end of the rope, making sure that what marketing wants to accomplish aligns with what enrollment needs to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that one thing that Jamie mentioned the inquiry model, but I think that was like the key to our success, being able to work together productively and effectively, was we actually broke up the goals. We said, here's how many enrolled students we need to drive period over period. Here's how many you're responsible for, and here's how many I'm responsible for. And then we had really clear data throughout the funnel that we were both accountable to as well. Things like lead quality, conversion rate, cost of acquisition. And so those were like our leading measures ahead of enrollments to keep us accountable. And those are then the conversations that we have when we come together, which is really nice, because then you have shared language. It takes a little bit of the emotion and the bias out of it, because we built the kind of the formula together and said, we think this is going to work because all these numbers basically add up at the bottom. And sort of, here's each role that we play. Here's the cogs and the wheels and how they all fit together. But when we go away and go to manage our teams, we are pretty clear on the particular role we each play. We're not really I mean, of course, we're stepping on each other's toes a little bit because we're both trying to drive not just demand at the top, but conversion down through the bottom of the funnel. But we're really clear on what those metrics are broken out through the funnel and who's responsible for what.
Yeah. And I imagine.
And I think it's important.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, it was a pivotal moment for the relationship between marketing enrollment at Point Loma Nazarene, without a doubt. And I think that COVID, the fact that we built it before COVID hit was really significant, because when COVID hit and my enrollment team could no longer be out in the field recruiting, then that meant I was only responsible for conversion. I couldn't get inquiries. We weren't in the field. We couldn't be out in the field. And people did a lot of virtual transfer fairs and whatnot. Let me tell you, no one showed up. It didn't work. So then we were able to say, okay, how many enrollments are coming from the enrollment side, that now we have to look and say, how can marketing cover some of that? And if not, then we at least know what our deficit's going to be. So it was helpful in a time when one of the, let's say, cogs in the wheel, you said, was removed and we couldn't use it. Now we knew where we were at a loss and where we could potentially shift effort or dollars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, the ease or difficulty, I think, in doing that often stems from that leadership thing. We started off by talking about the different leadership structures or reporting structures. And depending on how far up the food chain you have to go before they have somebody in common, right? Sometimes dictates how smoothly some of those transitions or the sharing of the lift, works or doesn't work. Because to the extent that they're siloed, it's hard to get that level of cooperation, one, quickly, and two, consistently, and I guess three, in a way that works, right? Or that yields meaningful results. If you don't have enough in common early enough, as far as, just leadership and somebody overseeing initiatives, that's tough.
Yeah, Andy, I think about you and me. I mean, we reported to the same person. So the accountability was there and was like, you two better make it happen. And we then worked together. And that was easy. It was built into the structure. At Point Loma, Sharon reported to the president. I reported to the provost. We had to come together and decide we're not going to blame each other. We're going to work together. And even when Sharon left, her successor, we had that same conversation. We said, we know we're going to disagree. We know there's going to be tough times, but at the end of the day, we're successful. We're going to have the most success when we collaborate. And so sometimes it's a logical decision, because sometimes you don't like your counterpart. Sharon, I like you. Andy, I like you. So no worries here. But sometimes you don't. But you have to come to the terms of, you're better off working together than working apart or blaming each other or fighting.
Right. Well, this ties a little bit into...
I would say that too.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I've had the pleasure of liking the enrollment people that I work with. But I would say too that going back to the data thing, when the data is on the table and we're all clear about what it says and kind of the yellow flags, the red flags, the green flags that it's throwing up, then it's a little bit, that bias isn't there. So we can come around the table and have that logical conversation about just what's working and what's not working. And I think even, let's say, Jamie, if you and I didn't like each other, I think that would have actually helped us. Coming around the table on the data, I think would have made it a lot easier, even if we didn't kind of have that congenial relationship.
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to something, Jamie, you said a minute ago, which was, our experience together. Obviously, we sat at the same table, but pre-COVID. We sat around the same table looking at the same reports. So there was a mutual agreement on the numbers, and there's a shout out for episode 2 for those of you that haven't heard the rest of the mini series, where we talked about numbers and data and making data informed decisions. And one of the issues we brought up was that it's great to have data, but it has to be mutually shared and mutually agreed upon data. Otherwise, I've got my reports and they say this. You've got your reports and they say this, right? What's the old cliche? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. I can make the numbers say what I need them to say so that my department's doing what it's supposed to do. But if we don't share those numbers and have mutually shared definitions about what the numbers mean and what the goals are, then we're just giving these, random updates to each other for no reason other than, well, now I know what you're doing, you know what I'm doing, ready, break, and we all go our separate ways and do separate things. But when you're sitting across the table from someone, realizing, well, this is my part of this report and I contributed this. And if I don't contribute this, then that number down there is affected. And even though you own it, I know I impacted it. Now you've got this shared ownership, shared accountability just by virtue of we're looking at the world through the same lens and through the same accountability, and we agree on the goal.
Yeah, so let's ask Sharon this question. You talked about Abilene Christian was more the Kinko's model, and you're shifting it. That means you're shifting toward, full collaboration with enrollment and talking about data and numbers. What are some of the steps you took to get on the same page and in agreement around the numbers and shared accountability?
Yeah, this is really top of mind right now. We're still actually in the middle of some of these conversations, but I think the first thing was actually trying to establish baseline. And it's funny too, because at Point Loma, I did a lot more in the online space, and at ACU, I do a lot more in the traditional space. So that's kind of another conversation too, is like the difference in collaborating with enrollment on the traditional side versus the online or adult side. But that said, yeah, really starting with baseline, trying to establish at a very practical level, how would we perform if we did nothing? So we actually looked at our data and said, okay, let's pull legacy students. Let's pull, for us, we're a Church of Christ school. So let's pull Church of Christ students out, athletes, to say, what is our baseline in terms of how would we perform if we did absolutely no marketing? And then start to look at like, okay, what's our cost of doing business? Then that difference was like, okay, this is the demand we need to drive. And now let's start actually modeling it out. Let's look at historical performance by lead source. And I had good conversations with my enrollment colleagues, and I was able to ask them questions about what's performed and not performed for you. Let's look at the data together. Let me ask questions so that we could start kind of plopping the numbers in and saying, this is performed well, generally converts at this percent. Okay, what's left? I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but really starting to look at, okay, how do we make up the difference between that baseline and our goal? Then starting to look at historical conversions and say, can we look at market factors on top of that and say, what share of market do we have? Is it realistic that we project growth in certain areas? So really just kind of like looking at all the data together at a table and saying, how do we sort of make a plan for how to grow off the base?
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that, because I think that often defines where that wall between these silos comes from. If marketing's accountability, data and otherwise is, hey, we're going to drive multiple campaigns. We've got student referral programs, on the more organic side. We've got search engine marketing. We've got paid social media marketing, and all of those campaigns. In marketing, we, of course, are going to track the performance of each of those campaigns, right? Which campaigns led to inquiries for which programs. And I would hope, and I know there's some institutions that don't, but I would hope you track that all the way through, inquiries, applications, and starts. But a lot of times marketing will stop at the level of, well, I got somebody to raise their hand and I, tossed it over the fence to you. What you do with it is up to you. Enrollment always, I say always, should always track that funnel, right? So from lead to application to acceptance to enrollment to start, census, wherever institutions draw that line, whatever those conversion metrics look like, enrollment is keenly aware of how they're doing with their inquiries, right? How many of them lead to an application or to a student who's accepted to a commitment or an enrollment or whatever. I'm shocked when I have conversations with folks on the marketing side who are not aware of the performance of the enrollment team by program, by lead source. Then there isn't feedback. The feedback loop is incomplete, and they don't get to hear how leads are converting. They're seemingly not interested. It's like, hey, well, we did our part. What shakes out in the end is somebody else's issue. And I always feel like what you're just addressing, we have to be talking about the whole funnel And both sides of the fence, both enrollment and marketing, have to be aware of what the other is doing in a professional, cordial, hopefully friendly way to say, what can we do? We're getting a bazillion leads for criminal justice, but none of them are converting. The number of starts is way low compared to the number of inquiries. What's happening? Do the enrollment counselors not understand the program? Are they not talking about it correctly? Are they not pitching it correctly? Or is there something about the advertising that's misleading people about what the degree actually is? But those kinds of conversations can't happen if there isn't mutually shared, ownership over the whole process, or at least even just seeing it as the same process.
Yeah, I think that's so common. And I think part of that is because of how so many marketing offices tend to just be a creative operation. So it's like, hey, I'm right. The right messaging is in the ads, the right look and feel is there. It's your job to convert them. But I think lead quality is that's where I think we both overlap the most, because like my job is to send quality leads that will convert. And so I have to understand the audience. I have to understand, why are people, like you said, why are people converting or not converting? And then to be able to report that back up to me to improve my performance. But for me to maybe raise some red flags and say, hey, like you said, we're driving a ton of demand. It may be a lead quality issue, which I need to address. It may also be all the way to a program issue. I mean, I think I'm trying to think of an example, but at Point Loma, I would think it was our nursing program. We were driving so many leads. They were affordable. We were getting a lot of market share on search ads, but they weren't converting. The counselors, which was a wealth of data, actually sitting in a room and talking to counselors and being like, what's happening when you're calling these leads? Tell me about that so I can understand what kind of conversations are you having? Is it a lead quality issue? Is it something else? Long story short, and I'm not saying this to say I haven't had lead quality issues and take blame off. I've certainly had to optimize on that end. But in that specific case, they didn't want the program offering. They found out more details about the program and it wasn't a right fit. So I was able to reallocate those dollars to something else that was actually going to drive demand, which is actually another thing that I think is important for marketing, to take ownership over things at a high level, to say, okay, I got $15,000 for ads for nursing. I spent that money, it's done. Well, what if you could reallocate half of that to another program and drive more revenue? Marketing needs to be accountable to those kinds of questions too, I think, just because they are spending a lot of institutional dollars if they have them.
Yeah, and that's partially a great segue to episode 5, where we're going to talk about the academy and why words like revenue are a bad word in so many places in higher ed, where we can't talk about our students as customers, and we can't talk about tuition as revenue, and some folks are allergic to the business terms within higher ed. But you're right, it does matter. And if you we have limited time, we have limited people, human resources and financial resources. How do we optimize those to serve the students who are interested, but also not waste our time or money doing things incorrectly, or aiming at the wrong audience, or attracting attention to a program that either doesn't exist because it's not quite as advertised, or what the program actually does, the learning outcomes don't match what we're putting as the shiny face of the ad. Those things have to be regularly looked at almost in real time, to make sure that we're not wasting people's time or money, whether it's enrollment or advertising dollars, generating the wrong kind of attention on the wrong things. But both of you,
I love that here.
Go ahead, Jen.
When I think about the relationship, I think about a Venn diagram, and Sharon and I have mapped this out before. The third circle is the academy. We'll talk about that next episode. But when I think about the Venn diagram, they're not circles on top of each other. They overlap, but they're not on top of each other. So when do I need to know about marketing campaigns? How deep do I need to know the data around marketing campaigns? And there is an answer to that, because everything is not the answer. All the time, all the data points is not the answer. I have to trust my partner that they know what they're doing, and that they'll flag something if they see something that seems off. And I know there were a number of times where I would call up Sharon and say, hey, can you look into this program? Tell me if you see anything off on the top of the funnel, because I'm not seeing things happening on the back end, the bottom of the funnel, where I think they should be at this point. And she would say, hey, no, everything looks good. Then I go to my counselors. Okay, what's happening? Let's dive deeper. I don't need to go in and say, show me your data, Sharon. I want to see, what's the campaign you're doing for that program. I don't need that detail. I have to trust. And this really speaks to a whole nother mini series, Andy, is, trust as a foundation. But like, I have to trust that they're the expert and they know,
Right.
and they're going to flag because they know that our success is interdependent, right? So they're going to flag it if they see something. I'm going to flag it. Then we're going to come together. It's like when Sharon talked about those nursing leads. She said, Jamie, what's going on? I said, I don't know. Meet with the counselors. They're going to know. And so that conversation is that overlap between the two circles in the Venn diagram of saying, let's come together because you might have information that I need that can help me on the front end at the top of the funnel. Yeah. And we have a contact center, and we were closing out our inquiries really late in the game. And so marketing comes to us and says, look, it's so late in the game, it's not helping us refine our campaigns. Can we agree upon a set time that when you close it out, or parameters on when you close it out, because that helps us refine what we're doing. The second we came to that agreement, we started seeing more quality inquiries coming in because we were able to get that refinement back into their campaigns. That's the beauty of the partnership. I don't need to know everything they're doing on their end. They don't need to know what conversations are taking place and why we would mark them as a bad inquiry, or close the contact. Mm-hmm. What they just need to know is, can we cut the time down? Instead of 3 months, do it at 1 month, because now that can feed back into the campaign. So I think that's the data. The crossover between the two is so key, but it can't be too much. If it's too much, I'm doing Sharon's job, and I do not want to be a marketing expert. It's not what I know how to do. Right. So why do I have to ask the questions as if she doesn't know? And so I think that respect and trust are so key in this relationship, because marketing and sales are two different things. Right. Well, and you hinted at that. You hinted at that structural efficiency, shared accountability. We touched on a lot of it. And I think what happens is that's a great example. That one example you just gave is a great illustration of a small thing that has big results, right? It's one tweak that you never would have found if the conversation didn't exist. And I think maybe a good place to wrap up is just making it a little practical for folks listening, depending on where you are, what level, what scope of responsibility you have. If you're a middle manager, you're probably feeling a little stuck, because the ability to change this stuff structurally or systematically might be a level or two above where you sit on a day-to-day basis. But I think for that person, there's still something that can be done to improve, the impact, whether you're in enrollment or in marketing. I think there's things that can be done, and you can be the tail that wags the dog a little bit without, insubordination or going over your boss's head. I think there are things that can be done. If you're listening to this, whether decisions are made at the director, VP, or C level, in other words, where those two worlds collide or come together, the first person they have in common, somebody has to initiate the conversation, kind of like earlier episodes about change and managing change and who initiates it, who has the authority or the courage to do it, at least initiate the conversation. Let's talk about a couple of practical things that could be done if they're not being done. If somebody's listening to this saying, man, we got a ways to go. We have two different teams. They don't like each other. They don't talk to each other. They don't share reports. They don't have meetings together. Let's talk about a practical few first steps, or if you've already taken a first step, maybe the second step. What kinds of things can people initiate at an institution to begin to improve the way these teams work well together? What were the first thoughts that come to you? Sharon, let's start with you.
I feel like kind of on two ends, one on the relational side and one on the performance side. I'd say on the relational side, I found that transparency and vulnerability are really good tools. I mean, they have to be used, appropriately and responsibly, but that empathy of hey, we're all just trying to do what's best for the institution. At the end of the day, we all want to meet enrollment goals. I found having pretty open conversations with my colleagues at whatever level I was at to say, that's where my vested interest is. I assume yours is too. Just give some space to say, hey, we don't have to solve a problem in this meeting, but just tell me about what you're experiencing. Because I think a lot of times we hop right into the data, which I love all of that stuff, but it tends to then people might feel on their back foot. Like you said, you could misinterpret it a bunch of different ways, but I found that open conversation, be like anything on the table. Let me get an intake of sort of what's going on, where you think you've had challenges, what's been frustrating for you in the past of working with marketing. Because to Jamie's point earlier, most people don't like working with marketing, and I've seen that frustration. I've asked when I started at ACU, I said, if you were in my chair, what would you do? Just to give people the opportunity to feel heard and for me to kind of see some patterns in terms of what's working, what's not working. On a practical end, I would say, it was so fun to be 5 years into a campaign that was like really high level and working. We were looking at cost per acquisition and all this great stuff. But rewind 4 or 5 years, that wasn't true. I ran ad sets for one program at a time and watched and saw what happened. Okay, this didn't work. Let's try this other thing. This one, the cost per acquisition is super high. Why is that? Let's run it for one program. Because if it works, of course, we're going to invest more money in it. And those were, thousands of dollars at a time, maybe. So I think that that's another thing, is to be comfortable with some baby steps, to try something, see if it works. If you have a small budget, a small team, you can make big impact with just testing some campaigns and then communicating out your wins to your colleagues and your leadership, and hopefully get more resources and more buy-in.
That's great. Jamie, what else? What are some practical first steps?
I love that Sharon mentioned being vulnerable, because I think you need to be honest with where you're at with hitting your goals. Many institutions are struggling with hitting their goals, and being able to say, why are we not hitting our goals? And I'm going to do a plug to our third episode, which is with Dr. Frank Rojas, because he gave me this feedback when I worked for him. I know Andy, you and I both worked with him closely. And he said, look, at the end of the day, I want to know why you're not hitting your numbers. If you can explain it to me, it means I know you have a pulse on what's going on. It's still a tough environment. It may means we have to adjust our goals, but you need to know why you aren't. And so I think if the teams can come together and in a very authentic way say, why are we not hitting it? Is it because we need to adjust our contact strategy with enrollment counselors? Is it because we don't have enough money to get digital leads? Or are they just not converting? Or, and this goes into, our fifth episode, it is what we're offering the program what the consumer still wants, or do changes need to be made? And I think if we can say, hey, we all have a part of the success, what part can I own that maybe I need to make some changes on? And be okay with it. Because if Sharon says, you know what, Jamie, it's not me. I think it's your area. And I need to be able to say, you know what, it is my area, because we just changed our phone system and my team just lost 2 weeks of work, or whatever it may be. Like, technology is breaking and I'm down. Okay, that's the reason. Now what? Now what do we do? So I think being able to say, instead of with a blame and a pointing of the finger, but each person having enough safety in the room to say, here's where my team's struggling right now, and I'm going to get some training for them, or I'm working on some technology shifts, or I'm changing the comm flow, whatever that may be. If we can own our part, and it be okay to own it, meaning, hey, from the get-go, we're going to set the ground rules. If we don't hit numbers, we just need to know why we did it and what we're going to do about it in the future.
Yeah.
It's not a slap the hand because you didn't get numbers. It's we know why, and we're fixing it. Yeah. We're taking steps in the right direction. But you've really got to create enough ownership and vulnerability and trust for that relationship to happen. So if you can strive to get to there, that is a really awesome place to sit.
Yeah, it is. And I'm really, it was encouraging to hear both of you mention the same two dimensions. There's a relational piece, which I guess you could call cultural as well, but there's a relational piece and then there's a performance piece, and they both need to be addressed. You really can't do one without the other and expect great results. So I'm hoping that if, for those who are listening, wondering how in the world do you begin to change a culture, I think both of those things are a piece of it. What baby steps can you take towards building relationships? In political terms, right? We talk about reaching across the aisle. What can you do to begin that dialogue? And maybe it won't happen as quickly as many people would like, but as we talked about in previous episodes, standing still at this point in time in the higher ed world is not an option. The winds of change are blowing so fast from so many directions. There's so many variables, demographic, financial, social, social attitudes towards higher ed in general, plus our financial situation, the demographic cliff. And we've talked about a bazillion things. We have enough headwinds. Not talking and not collaborating internally really shouldn't be one of them. Which, by the way, is a great segue to the next episode where, brace yourselves, in the same breath, we're going to talk about marketing, enrollment, and the academy. Can you imagine? So stay tuned for that. Sharon, thanks so much for joining us. It was great to have you on. Loved hearing what's going on in your world. And if for no other reason, just acknowledging that we're not freaks for experiencing the same things. But it was a pleasure to have you on to talk about it, and best of luck to you and at Abilene Christian and all that you're trying to accomplish. Happy anniversary on your 1 year. Don't worry, it's all downhill from here.
Awesome.
Yeah,
glad to hear that. Can't wait for the downhill.
No, it's a complete cakewalk from here on out. You're gonna be just fine. And for everybody else, again, thanks for joining us for this special edition of the EdUp Experience podcast. Stay tuned for our next episode, part 5 again, where we just simply called it, and then there's the Academy. So until then, good luck to you. Take care. We'll talk soon.